Let me take you on a journey on the Esopus. It begins off the side of Slide Mountain, part of the high peaks of the Catskills, and travels for about half of its 60-plus miles and ends up in the Ashokan Reservoir. 13 miles long. It's a beautiful, long reservoir. But the journey that we're focusing on is the journey below the Ashokan Reservoir. That journey is extra special because it goes through so many different pieces of history. We're in Saugerties, and Saugerties is the last stop before the Esopus Creek enters the Hudson River. Part of the growth of the Esopus community has been this beautiful waterway. It's attracted people to it. The Esopus Creek, that's named for Lenape Indians that used to come to this area, it's now an opportunity again to reconnect communities, businesses, recreation to the Esopus so that the new wave of people who've moved to our region can benefit like these people out here are. Interacting with the creek as a source of inspiration, a source of open space. The Esopus Creek is a historic creek. It's part of our stewardship to maintain and protect what brought us to this area.
This is a beautiful stretch of the Esopus Creek, and this is where I grew up. The people who lived here in prehistoric or prehistory culture, they were Lenape Indians. Their culture was the oldest of the Algonquian cultures. It used to be said that when the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois and Mohican, the other Algonquin culture, would come upon a Lenape person, they would greet them as Machusik, which meant, hello, grandfather. And the last band of Lenapes, they were the people who sold the land to the English governor in 1672, around there. Probably people were living along this creek 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And maize and beans were introduced by the Western Indians, by the Haudenosaunee, in the mid-14th century. They were sedentary people and lived off the streams in the summer. In the fall, they would migrate towards the foothills for the larger animals. And in our area, the culture was across from the beach in that bowl-shaped area, probably composed of more than one tribe, but the largest one lived along the water. The guesstimate on population of Indians in the Hudson Valley was 8,000 to 10,000 during the 16th century. The decline of the population of the Native Americans in the 17th century was basically due to the arrival of the Europeans. And over the 40 years after Henry Hudson arrived, the Native American population in the Hudson Valley was reduced by about 90%. The Europeans brought new forms of disease, things that the Indians never had or never knew about, the common cold, for example. And really the first to die were the leaders of the tribes, so that the tribes became decentralized or did not have a leadership structure to fall back upon. The bulk of the Esopus Indians were forced to leave or killed off after 1665, when the Second Esopus War was negotiated by Peter Stuyvesant. There was some warring among the Indians themselves over who could control the trade. But the trade also kind of instituted their demise, because the principal animal that was harvested in the trade was the beaver. And the beaver was the mythical earth brother. And it may be apocryphal, but I think it makes sense in a spiritual way. The dissolution of a certain worldview that went with the killing of the beavers. Let me read to you from a little piece. Religion was inseparable from ecology. Europeans arriving in the Hudson Valley stepped into a physical world incapable of dialogue or communication. Yet the same world to the Indian was vibrant with an active spirituality. The cognizance of humans was shared by bears, turtles, wolves. Trees had thought, language, magic powers. The sun was the elder brother. The earth, moon, wind, and other aspects of nature cherished also as relatives. These notions were as real to the Native Americans as Christ's resurrection was to the Europeans. Dutch were Calvinists. They saw things in black and white in terms of their own religion. And they had no concept that people could have any other form of spiritual life or way to exist.
In Saugerties, you have the cumulative water flow of the Esopus. So what we're looking at here is the collection of the entire drainage area of the Esopus. So all the tributaries, all the big creeks, the little creeks, they've all collected by the time the creek ends up in Saugerties. Below the reservoir, the two primary sources of water are from two major tributaries. You have the Sawkill tributary, and then later you have the Plattekill tributary. It's almost 50% of the water that ends up in the creek. So Saugerties had enough volume to harness the water power and drive industrial strength.
Water is life, and it's also power in this case.
Saugerties got its power and its reputation from the Esopus, if you will.
Saugerties is the first industrialized site for water power on the Hudson River.
Saugerties became the Silicon Valley of paper making at that moment in time. Before that, it was a sleepy little town, and every stream coming out of the mountains had a grist mill or a sawmill on it, and it just so happens that this big stream had a really big fall just before the Hudson River, and because it was close to the Hudson River, you could marry shipping and manufacturing via water power, and that's kind of why here, serendipitously, it's here. Henry Barclay saw the water coming from the Esopus into the Hudson, and he says you could build an entire water-powered industrial park. They realized they had to get water, and a lot of water down there, so they were going to have to build a dam.
The Esopus Creek, it makes a big U-turn and comes around to about the same place on the opposite side. So all of these rock formations that you see in here divide the mills that were on the other side from the dam that's on this side. They made the rock cut over here in order to be able to have a 40-foot drop of the height of the water you see in the mill pond here down to the tidewater of the Hudson River, making a force of water cutting this horseshoe bend in half. So that is what supplied all of the water wheels on the other side.
There was, of course, coloring of paper and bleaching of paper, and chemicals being brought in left and right.
The bleaches, the whitings, all of the different processes that you had to have the rag go through, digesting it down into the quality you could use for making paper. You had all of these contaminants that were just washed through. You know, you can see them flushing here. In fact, the fishermen downstream, or going out into the Hudson River, used to know exactly what they would catch based on the color that was going into the tidewater. I mean, the most controversial thing about this whole site here is that originally it was a lead mill. So you have a lot of lead that is in the soil, and further upstream there was another lead mill. And it progressively got to be one of the largest manufacturers of lead paint in the United States. The village side was all agrarian, but it was completely separated from the big mansions on the industrial side. By the time you put the bridge in, there was no division. The population hit 3,000 within probably 4 years.
I think that if the potential of the Esopus Creek had not been realized, I don't believe we would have Saugerties as we have it today. Henry Barclay, seeing that there was water power and recognizing that it would be a good spot for industry, mortgaged 400 acres of property using money from Robert Livingston. And Henry wanted to build a utopia. He built the paper mill and the iron mill, and he rented out properties along the creek to people who would hire lots of people. He didn't want somebody that had 2 people in employ. He wanted 50, 100 in the employ. So there was a chair factory, an axe factory. There were sawmills. There were all kinds of things along the creek. And then he laid out the streets. He built the houses, or had the houses built. He wanted a community of friendly people. And we can lay 3 churches to his credit: Trinity Episcopal, Saugerties Methodist, and St. Mary's.
In the 19th century, there was the industrial growth going on, but there was also this need, this appreciation for coming to nature to revive your soul. Rivers and creeks were a draw for different communities, and so it was a natural to have civilization grow up around a waterway. The interaction between the Esopus and the Hudson is direct. It's part of our strength, it's part of our joy, it's part of why artists and poets and writers have come to the area. It's a rich part of the history of the Hudson River Valley. It's a rich part of New York State, and each of the communities along it thrive when the creek is thriving.
This was the front door into Saugerties for 200 years. This was how most people and most goods arrived in Saugerties. The Hudson River was the throughway of its time. The steamboats would arrive over there. We have photos of this creek just full of ships and barges. This is the site of what was the Joseph Sheffield Paper Company. It was built in 1827, one of Henry Barclay's enterprises here. It's built below the dam on the tidal portion of the lower Esopus Creek. This plant was the first place in North America that had a machine that made paper on a roll rather than in sheets. It was a prosperous business all through the 1800s and into the 1900s. By the early 60s, many of the buildings were not being used, and there was a terrific fire that burned through here that destroyed much of the buildings that had originally stretched from here over to East Bridge Street. By the time I came here, this place had grown up like a jungle, obscuring much of the remains of the buildings here. It was like a Mayan ruins, you know. Right behind us is a coal bin. They burned tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of coal, and this property, this land, is just embedded with that coal ash. Part of the process of healing this place is putting a protective layer of clean soil over this and turn this place into the Tidewater Center for arts, culture, and local heritage. We're going to build a 45 by 45 foot awning structure in that end of the coal bin for performances and assemblies of all different kinds. And then a performing arts center right on top of the coal bin, sitting up at the level of the top of these walls. So this would, in a sense, be the cellar. We're creating an artist-built waterworks playground in which people can see how water can be made to turn things and channeled, and models that demonstrate the hydrological processes of watersheds and how the health of the land affects the health of the water. What attracts me to this place is that really the whole world is here. It connects with the high peaks of the Catskills, where the headwaters of the Esopus Creek gather. It plunges over the dam and meets really what is, in a sense, the ocean. Now, this isn't salt water, but it is tide water, very much the heartbeat of the planet with the pulse of the tides here.
After the last waterfall that the creek travels over, it comes to this mile-long tidal section where it releases all this sediment from all the different peaks that it's traveled through. And at the end of that mile is the Saugerties Lighthouse and a lovely Esopus estuary. The Esopus estuary is especially rich as a nursery for different fish, and that's an important part of the habitat and the sustainability of the Hudson River.
Here we are at the confluence of the Esopus Creek where it meets the Hudson River, the Saugerties Lighthouse. This was built 150 years ago in 1869 to mark the tidal flats that are all around the mouth of the creek. All the sediment that's been delivered to the river over the centuries has created a wide delta, which was a hindrance to navigation, so they put a lighthouse here. The interesting, I guess, unintended consequences of having this spit of land sticking out here, if you imagine almost like a catcher's mitt or even like the baleen of a whale, as the water comes down, it catches all sorts of things coming down the river. Well, we find a lot of these, old somebody's Bic lighter and random pieces of plastic. Whatever floats find its way into the river, and a lot of it washed up right here on the shore. It's a constant effort to keep the shoreline clean, but it's also a lesson in what goes on the ground ends up in the river eventually. We've got a mix of duckweed, water celery, and plenty of water chestnuts. Squirrels collect them along the shoreline. In the spring and the fall, there's a resident beaver swims out around the lighthouse to the shoreline to collect water chestnuts, and in the twilight you'll hear a crunch crunch. There's a green one, and you can see evidence that something's chewed on it. So there's like a white pulp in there that they've chewed out. You know, I understand the desire for people to kind of take on these invasives, but to me it's still kind of that humans versus nature. We've got to battle this invasive instead of dealing with human nature. The issues of like plastic pollution, climate change. When the lighthouse was built, there was no connection to the shoreline. There were no jetties or dikes. Those came later. And the Army Corps dredged to deepen the harbor for Saugerties so that more steamboats and barges could get out of the creek. But you know, nowadays we watch tug barges and freighters. Actually, here comes a quite large freighter down the river. Saugerties might be a sleepy river town, but we're watching the global supply chain go past us here.
Human civilization and human growth is very directly tied to water quality. Part of the stewardship is understanding that our land use is reflected in the water quality of our waterways. We're opposite the beautiful Esopus Bend Nature Preserve, the vision of lots and lots of village and town of Saugerties residents, a large expanse of riparian forest, waterside forest, was worthy of protecting. And because of that, the creek has better water quality than it would otherwise.
Esopus Bend Nature Preserve is roughly 160 acres, and it's owned and operated by Esopus Creek Conservancy. The topography in the preserve is very steep, very irregular, and the soils are such that you have very sandy soils on top of clay. So that's the kind of conditions that result in a lot of erosion. The tributaries carry a lot of sediment out into the creek. We're standing on the boardwalk right now, down in the wetlands. It's probably the most environmentally sensitive part of the preserve. Everything we're standing on now, where the boardwalk is situated, even extending out, is a result of sediment that has been carried down through a couple of tributaries and deposited here over, what would it be, about 70 or so years. In fact, where we're standing right now, when I looked at the aerial photo from the late 1950s, there's no land out here. This is all water. Prior to that, prior to the damming of the creek, obviously this would have been land. I mean, what flooded this in the first place was the damming of the creek. As far as invasives are concerned, the preserve is a good classroom for non-native invasive species. It's typical of what happens when farmland is abandoned. Pioneer species that are often invasive non-native species come in when the property is no longer managed. What we're surrounded with here is Phragmites, common reed, and that's an invasive plant. And we have many other invasives in the preserve. The Oriental bittersweet is the big vines that you'll see as you're walking through the woodland trails, climbing up on trees. Japanese stilt grass is covering the ground. Amazing how quickly that came in 10 to 15 years ago. Certainly wasn't anywhere near the magnitude that it is now. The positive side of that is it's actually done a pretty good job at driving out things like garlic mustard that used to be a lot more prolific. So this is one invasive being more invasive, more aggressive than another invasive. If you look out onto the delta here, there's the water chestnut, an aquatic invasive that's pretty much choking out all of the native vegetation in there, along with Eurasian milfoil. There's different points of view and speculation about whether certain fish benefit from it because it does provide cover and even some other aquatic life. But then there's also the concern that it's changing the water temperature and even reducing the amount of oxygen in the water. Some invasive species, even though they're non-native and they're invasive, they actually have a lot of positive characteristics. The problem is they're just too much of anything is no good.
The water chestnuts are annuals, little spikes that lie dormant for more than 10 years and then come to the surface and grow more seeds that can drop into the sediment. If you pull them out, if you cut them off, you can begin to make a difference. You can remove them. And then the Eurasian milfoil is the exact opposite. It is very fragile. It's buried also in the sediment, but it's a perennial. It is not easily removed, and just a little bit of its feathery leaves can fragment and propagate a new milfoil. Recently, community members in the village and the town have joined together and said, what can we do? So this year, the village and the town of Saugerties purchased something called an eco-harvester. And it very gently pulls up by the root the water chestnuts and the milfoil. These plants are then composted and make soil that helps grow plants in our community gardens. The part of the story that is still a work in progress is helping all of the community understand that they have a stewardship role in reducing stormwater runoff that has in it phosphorus and nitrogen that are actually fertilizing these invasive plants. When I first started doing watershed work, I very quickly learned that some of the best stewards of nature and of water are trout and other fishermen, sports people that want to preserve the water quality, want a healthy recreational habitat for fish or other animals. It's such a happy interaction between the community and the creek. Each person brings with them a different story, a different personal favorite place, or a different favorite bird or tree or fish or place to go quietly commune with nature.
Edith Bolt said the trees look like they're dancing, and I'm really glad she said that. She's here somewhere. My family moved here from Canada, and we had 4 kids under 5 years old. So my mother would walk us down to the beach. It's one of my first memories of being in Saugerties. We would come down here all the time, and I remember going on the playground and going in the water and playing in the sand. I learned how to swim here, shared the water with turtles, and got to know the fish and all the little creatures that are down here. And all those memories came back when I was designing the mural. I thought about the trees, and I thought about how beautiful it is down here and how tranquil and calm I feel, and realized how important it was. The trees, when I designed those, I wasn't so much thinking about their species or anything like that. I was thinking about personalities, that's why their branches are uplifted as if they're dancing. Some of the neighbors would come down and give me suggestions about, you should put this bird in, or you should put this creature in. There's a little girl who came over, and because of her, there's a praying mantis in there. Little creatures that people can find and children can find when they come down to visit. I was asked by Suzanne Bennett of Shout Out Saugerties if I would be interested in doing a mural. We were supported by the town and the village of Saugerties, which is terrific. This is the beach house. It's the bathroom and the storeroom and the lifeguards changing room. And the idea was to tie in this whole area here at the beach. The birds and the creatures and the water, the Esopus Bend Preserve. It's just so beautiful to look out and see the water and the wetlands, and to experience the things that happen at all different times of the day. There's always something different happening. When I was painting the mural, people would come down in the morning and they would sit, calmly and either just stare at the water or be reading books. So it's not just for swimming, it's for all times of the year. The beach has always been a place where people gather. One of the nicest things that I see when I am down here is the diverse population of people who are enjoying the beach, like I did when I was little.
I've been around water all my life and loved it, but moving to the Catskills, moving to the Hudson River Valley, I appreciated water on a whole other level. Water, to me, is a public natural resource. So by bringing green spaces to blue spaces, it's that symbiosis of understanding the beauty of open space near water.
Follow the water down, follow it down, all along the Esopus now, to the lighthouse, to the lighthouse. Follow the water, yes, I follow it down, as I'm Hudson bound, down the Esopus. Follow the water down, follow it down, see the light shine from the lighthouse. I follow it down, follow the water.